Okay, I'm Wendelle Stevens, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. I have been investigating this phenomena for over 50 years. It actually began in the Air Force when I was reassigned to Alaska. I was working in the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. I was a test pilot in the Flight Test Division there. All pilots had to have an additional, actually a primary duty. Flying was your additional duty. So my primary duty was in the Air Technical Intelligence Center screening the captured war documents from the former enemies, and they were coming in by the ship road to the ports and the truckload to Air Materiel Command. I had save lists from our contractors, government contractors. I had save lists from the government. We had our own save lists, and I had my own particular save list. And what we didn't save was sent to the shredder. It was shredded and burned. And some interesting things came back. One thing, for example, that went across my desk that I later was very sorry about was a map from Germany. It was a battle map, and it was in color, and it showed the array of forces near the end of the war, near the collapse of Germany, and it showed what the forces coming from the east and from the west, and what looked like an escape corridor to the south if anybody wanted to get out. That was all white. Now on that map were 9 little Saturn-shaped symbols stamped on with a rubber stamp. And I didn't know what they were, I didn't know what they meant at the time, and I sent the map to the shredder and it was burned. And later I found that those were the Kugelblitz development facilities run by the Germans, where they developed their own disk programs. And then I was sorry that I had destroyed it. But later I found a copy of a similar map in a book published in Canada on what they called the Samizdat Press, by Mattern and Friedrich, that showed a similar map, or maybe even the same map, that showed those 9 positions with the little Saturn-shaped symbols. And they were explained as representing the 9 research facilities developed by the Germans for that program. That program, incidentally, was kept under the tightest control by the SS. It developed under the SS, and they decided to keep it under their control in a special staff office called the Entwicklungsstelle SSE4. And they controlled all of the development information on the various disk programs. They had several go. By the time the war ended, they had 9. Now, when the Germans were reversed in Russia and they saw they weren't going to win the war anymore, they began dismantling those factories and evacuating them. The ones that they couldn't successfully dismantle, they just blew up and destroyed them. We believe that the Russians captured one partly intact, enough to get some information out of it. We were unable to capture an intact facility, but we did capture something like 9 of their disks in various stages of development and shipped them back to White Sands Missile Test. Project Sign, as I said, was organized on the ground floor as a public information office. And they were only given information that was purged and sent down to them from upstairs. So what they got had a lot of blacked out, censorship blacked out on their reports, and they had to conclude for the public what caused the situation from what was already deleted, which they didn't know. So the public accepted the idea that this was the agency to contact on new reports, and they began to get letter reports from the public itself, which were different from the reports that were coming down from upstairs. And they found that there seemed to be things really happening that were not, the upstairs didn't seem to know about. So they started following up on some of these letters and began to go out and look at a few of the cases, and decided that there was more to this than meets the eye, and more than they were getting from upstairs. So they thought they were helping the upstairs by collecting information, and they tried to investigate more and more and send it upstairs. This defeated the purpose, because now, instead of explaining it all to the public, they're raising the interest level. So they closed Project Sign, boxed all the records, and reassigned everybody. Then the cases continued, and reports kept coming in. The public now wants to know, well, who's going to handle it now? Where's the office we report these things to? So they had to reopen the office someplace, and the Air Force didn't want to take it. They did everything they could do to avoid it. They tried to get the government to give it to NASA. They tried to get them to give it to the Navy. They tried to get them to give it to the Army. They tried to avoid it every way they could, and finally the Chief of Staff of the Air Force says, no, you're going to take it. So they reopened the boxes and named it Project Grudge. This time they assigned a first lieutenant and a second lieutenant, 3 sergeants, and 2 secretaries. And someplace midway in Project Grudge, they added a captain, replaced the first lieutenant with a captain, Captain Ruppelt. The same thing happened with Project Sign, and Ruppelt began investigating cases on his own, a kind of a maverick. He didn't have authorization to do it, but he was getting information that was meaningful, and he would follow up on it. And he finally he collected his own information. He wrote a book, and he sold a book to a book of the month publishing house, and they published it. And when the Air Force found out about it, they ordered the publishing house to recall all the books and have the last chapter rewritten. Ruppelt had concluded that there was certainly something going on here with the last words, only time will tell. The government made him rewrite the whole last chapter, saying that there was really nothing to this and that it was not worth spending a lot of money on investigating. And that was republished and sent out in the place of the first edition. So you could tell if you have an original edition, if it has if the last 3 words in the book say only time will tell, that's the original edition. Government failed to catch them all. There's a few out, but not many. The rest of them will have a different ending to the book. That was written by Captain Ruppelt. Now Ruppelt, because he did that, and because the staff now is looking for cases and collecting information, they closed Project Grudge. And the Air Force once more tried to get rid of it. Or again, they were ordered to take it on. So this time they looked for an officer, a climber, that will obey all the instructions. He tries to please his commander the best way he can all the time, anxious to be promoted. They found that in the form of Major Hector Quintanilla. When the commander of Air Materiel Command interviewed him and told him that he was going to be given all the material the Air Force had on the subject, and he was going to have to answer to the public, report to the public on this. He thought and wanted to believe and did believe that he had everything in his office. He still only had a ceiling classification of confidential. He only had purged reports, but he didn't care. He's trying to please his superiors by saying, and he really believed, I think, that he was being given everything. And that rocked along that way until the government hired the Condon. They were looking for somebody to take the wind out of the sails of the UFO phenomena, and they hired the Condon Committee to run an official investigation and find out if it was really necessary for the government to get into this investigation. Well, of course, they're in it all the time at the upper staff level, but they're trying to keep the public from knowing about that. So they found the one they were looking for in the form of the University of Colorado, which owed the government a few things, and they paid them $500,000 to run a proper investigation with a specific finding. Now, what kind of an investigation is that? They had to find what they found. That was what they were paid for. So they hired people that they thought would follow toe the line, would follow the directions of the director of the project, who was, gosh, I forget, Condon, Ulysses Condon from the Colorado University. And he had scientists that didn't agree with this project, and they felt independent, and one of them wrote a book, UFOs Yes, 2 more quit the project. When it came to writing the final report, they wrote the final report they thought it ought to get, and when it got to Condon, he said, no, we can't do that. And he rewrote the report. And that report that came out of that was Condon's report himself, and he cut out all the stuff that would support anything, and ended with the conclusion that there was not enough indication that this was a serious matter for the Air Force to be expending any more money in conducting research and investigating the cases. But an upper staff continued to do that anyway, and it was more people and more heavily funded than ever before. But that's what the projects were. So they closed Project Blue Book, send all the files to the Air University at Montgomery, Alabama. That's where they are today. They're closed files. There is no public information office at this time to answer the question. If you look any place, they say the project was closed and the files are at Montgomery, Alabama. Go look at them. At that time, the government had a standard rotation project. All the active duty officers would spend 2 years in the zone of interior, that's the United States, and then 2 years out of the zone of interior, that's an overseas assignment. And they'd rotate you back and forth. So I had been in the States for 2 years at the Air Materiel Command, and I was coming up for rotational reassignment. And I was supposed to be reassigned overseas for another 2 years, and when it came, it was an assignment to Anchorage, Alaska. Now, at that time, Alaska was a province, or it was a territory of the United States, and it was considered an overseas assignment because it was not part of the zone of interior at that time. And so when I got to Alaska, I found that I had been reassigned to a position outside of my specialty. My specialty was logistics, and I was assigned up there in an operations specialty, which I had no training for. And when I got to Anchorage, I found that I was going to be the assistant base operations officer for a properly trained base operations officer. But my additional duty would be to supervise a team of highly qualified, high classified civilian technicians, career technicians, that were installing special equipment aboard the B-29s that were being winterized in Anchorage Air Depot, and then flew their target profiles on Russia and coming back. And every crew had to fly this once every year. So the B-29s were already flying in the Arctic. We had a lot of reports indicating that the phenomena was coming from the Arctic. I think there was an upper staff level that thought the Russians might have developed something and be trying to use it or to experiment with it. We knew that the Russians had captured part of one of the Kugelblitz factories way up in Northwood on the Russian border, which is north of Poland. And so I think that's what the upper staff had in mind when they set this project up. Now, what we did to the B-29s after they were winterized, where they changed the rubber seals to neoprene seals, a lot of things like that, so they wouldn't break down in the cold. Then my team would of civilians would install extra 35 millimeter cameras aboard. There's already a 16 millimeter cameras. There's a 16 millimeter camera in every gun position already on the B-29. We gave them a couple more handheld 16 millimeter cameras to carry around. We put a 35 millimeter camera aboard. We even had we had four 4x5 press cameras that took pictures on a 4-inch by 5-inch negative, good pictures on high density film. We put a Fairchild K20 camera aboard, which takes a picture on an 8-inch by 10-inch negative, a heavy thing that was hard to even carry around. We installed surge detectors in every electrical system on the B-29. I think there's 5. We installed radio frequency emission scanners aboard that scanned the radio frequency spectrum, homed on the strongest signal, copied it for 30 seconds, canceled it, and homed again until it got the next strongest signal, canceled that till it canceled them all, then it'd start over. And it recorded for 30 seconds, then start over. So this continually went on. We also installed ambient thermal detectors to measure rises in the ambient temperature aboard the aircraft. We installed magnetic detectors to tell us if there's any changes in the magnetic field at the times. But it was a good kit of equipment. And every time they experienced an incident, they were required to report back in a coded report to the home base. And we knew when they were coming in if they had experienced an incident. When they landed, we'd separate all the crew members and put them in separate rooms, and then interrogate them one at a time with stenographers taking down their testimony on what they saw. And all of that would be packaged with the film rolls, the cartridges, the cassettes, everything. It was downloaded from the equipment that we'd put aboard. And that would be packed in a metal box and chained to an officer's wrist and flown to Washington that night. So I never got to see any of that because there was no way for me to read it, the tapes, no way for me to develop pictures in time. They didn't want me to do it anyway. I was forbidden to do anything but debrief the crews and sign the reports and send them to Washington. So I know that we sent some interesting cases forward. I've never heard of those cases since then. One of the cases, for instance, involved a 200-foot diameter disc, estimated, sitting on the ice pack ahead of an approaching B-29, And as the B-29 got close enough to get a pretty good look at it, it jumped into the air and flew away. Now this 200-foot diameter ship left the ground, leaving nothing behind, no ground equipment, not even an oil slick on the ground. When we'd launched a B-29 for those missions, we had a sea of equipment around the B-29, bigger than the B-29 ever was, left behind when it took off. And so this was a unique. There's no way we could launch anything up there that way, and somebody else is doing it all the time, apparently. They also came on one time that was sitting on the water and submerged as it got closer and went under the water and disappeared. Another report we had was of one that emerged from the water and flew away in front of the B-29. We had one report where estimated 60-foot diameter disc got in the slot between the big wing and the little wing on the right side of the airplane, and they got pictures with all the cameras and the recording equipment aboard the airplane, electrical disturbances, radio frequency disturbance, magnetic disturbance, all of those things in one incident, and they rotated the crews past the window on that side so they could all get a look at it, including the forward crews. And those were sent to Washington. You never heard any of those. So they go someplace, and they're someplace in the files, but we've never heard of them and probably never see them. That was what I was doing in Alaska. Well, I have to believe that there's a cover-up going on. By the way, my superior, Major Moss, who left before I did, about 6 months before I did, and came back to the States, my wife and I had developed a friendly relationship with him where we'd go to dinner with, play cards with him at night and everything. And when we rotated back from the Alaskan Theater, we were coming through California, and he had become the base operations officer at McClellan Air Force Base, which was headquarters Western Air Defense Force area. So we're spending the night in his apartment on base at McClellan, and I asked him about whatever happened to all the stuff, the information that we were collecting, and he said, well, you know, he said, I didn't believe that it was real at the time, but he said, when I got down here, I found that there's file cabinets full of information. Everything west of the Mississippi is reported through here. So, and he said, it's a lot more highly classified than you think, and there's big offices involved, but it's all clandestine. It's all kept very carefully under control. So he had become convinced. And when I tried to follow the reports I sent to Washington one time when I was there, they told me I didn't have a classification for any of that. Besides, I didn't have any business looking for it. I said, well, I sent some of it. It doesn't make any difference. You're not in the need-to-know loop. We don't know anything about it. But I can tell you what happens to those cases. We had an incident that happened over Tucson in, oh gosh, I think it was about 1975 or 76, where a B-29 bomber was refueling on a tanker over the Catalina Mountains north of Tucson. And while they were doing this, a big disc, about 60 feet in diameter, came in close to the refueling operation as though it was observing it, and both the tanker crew and the B-29 crew watched it. And it stayed there for 12 to 15 minutes. They all rotated the crews again, everybody got a look at it. They reported this in their coded reporting, and when the airplane landed, the crews were separated and into separate rooms, and headquarters Air Defense Force, Western Air Defense Force area was notified. They had an official Air Force UFO investigation team, and that team was headed by a major. He had about 2 staff sergeants. He had a tech sergeant. I think he even had a master sergeant on the team. He had another officer with him, and when the case was reported, Western Air Defense Force area said, keep them separated, we're on our way over. And they arrived the same day in military aircraft. And they set up interviews the next morning in the base courthouse at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. And they were bringing the crews in one at a time for separate interrogation, and stenographers were taken, like we did in Alaska, taking down their testimony. The siren blew, and they were going to break for lunch. There the siren blows, everybody goes to lunch, you're all back at 1 o'clock. So they stopped their interviews and said, okay, lunch break, and they all started out the door. And when Rudy Pestalozzi went out the door with his team, they see a lot of people standing in the streets all looking up with their mouths open. They looked up, and here's the silvery disc and high station, and another one zipping back and forth over the field like this. By the way, this is the time this has ever been told publicly. So the one that was flying low over the streets then went up on high station, and the top one came down and did the same thing for about 15 minutes. This went on. The people, when the phenomena left, the people went to lunch, but the speakers on the base started ordering everybody to their sections for a briefing. Meantime, the section commanders and staff officers were told to assemble the people and tell them that this was a military exercise that they had observed, and it was a secret exercise, and it would be worth their job to say anything to anybody about it, even their family at home. And they successfully kept that down. Now, Rudy and his team ran back in and got their equipment. They had 2 4x5 press cameras. They had 2 35mm hand cameras, all of them full of film. They had an 8mm movie camera, and they had rolls of film for that. And they got out in the street and they started shooting pictures and taking movies of what's going on. When they got through, they had quite a bit. They had several rolls of 35mm film, about 6 press packs, 4x5 press packs. They had rolls of movie film. They had the 35mm film, whole roll shot. And they didn't even go to lunch. They closed the photo lab, took all their photo gear over there, and they had the lab people process it out while they watched. They got all their prints, hundreds of prints, because they'd shot in 36 shot rolls in several rolls, and the 4x5 press. So the photo lab printed them all up, developed them all out, and printed them all up. Now, the standard routing for this at the time was 8 copies. They made 8 copies of everything, and this report was several hundred pages thick. It was about 4.5 inches thick, with all the photographs in it, and all the narrative testimony. So it was made in 8 copies, and for normal distribution. And I'll try to remember what that was. 1 copy stayed at the home base. Another one went to the rest of the copies, the 7 copies, went to the command headquarters, which was Headquarters 12th Air Force at Waco at the time. Waco pulled off a copy and kept it, and sent a copy to ADC, and another copy to Air Materiel Command, and the remaining 4 copies to headquarters, up through intelligence channels to Headquarters Air Force. We don't know what they did with all of those. So we heard about this, so we went out there to see what the base would tell us. They told us nothing happened. So we asked if we could see the files. We talked to photo lab people that worked on the project, and at this time I had Rudy Pestalozzi with me, who was there at the time and made the reports. And he had retired and moved to Tucson, and I knew him at George Air Force Base before either of us retired. We met, and he was telling me about this report. I never heard anything about it till Rudy retired and came to Tucson, because nothing got in our newspapers and nothing leaked out. It was carefully stopped. And so he tells me about it, so we went out to the base to look for the base copy that he turned into him. And all there was a telegram in the file with a code number for the telegram, and ordering to package the file and send it up the channels. So they sent their package to their big file to Headquarters 12th Air Force. When we went to Headquarters 12th Air Force to look for it, ours had been packaged with theirs, and the 2 had gone someplace else. And I believe that all those, that up the channels, they were all collected in one place at the top level and put in the files. So there was a magnificent report. Now, you've heard of Dr. James McDonald from the University of Arizona. He was teaching, he was an atmospheric sciences professor. And he was teaching a class in mathematics that Rudy Pestalozzi, the former intelligence officer from Western Air Defense Force area, was sitting in the class. And something came up about UFOs, and the class snickered, and the professor snickered too. Well, you know, it's foolish. And Rudy felt bad about this because he knows what's going on. So we went up to the professor after class left, and he said, "I noticed you took that lightly. Do you think there is no such thing to this?" The professor says, "Of course, Blue Book explained it all long ago." Rudy said, "My poor man," he said, "would you like to know more about it?" The professor says, "Did you know anything?" And he said, "Yes, I handled some of the reports. If you'd like to know something more, come to my house tonight at 8 o'clock, and we'll give you some information," showing to demonstrate that Blue Book doesn't get all the information. So we gave him this case and 4 other cases that he could go to Wright Field and verify that they went through right field, but they didn't go to Project Blue Book. So he took his summer vacation that year to do it. And he went to right field, and he didn't find them in Project. He found that at that time he found that the project, then it was Project Blue Book files, were only had a low classification and didn't have any real meat in their files. And he went upstairs, and he got people to admit that there were other reports, but that he didn't have any classification to see them. So he went to see the commanding general of Air Materiel Command, and they called in another general, and he said, "What's happening to all these reports? I know this was sent to you. I have interviewed the man that prepared it. Now, has anybody seen it here, or was it lost?" The general said, "Well, yeah, we saw it, went through." But he said, "Well, where is it now?" He said, "We sent them up, just like, we always do." So he said, "Well, where do you send it?" They said, "Ours went to Washington." So McDonald went to Washington. He was looking for it in the Pentagon. He couldn't score anything there. So at that time, that president was having a presidential breakfast every morning, and he would invite a couple of congressmen and a couple of senators to sit in with his cabinet for the breakfast briefing. And the custom was the president would make his statement to his staff. Then he would invite the staff in order of rank on down to comment on it or offer anything that they wanted to contribute to the meeting that morning. And as a courtesy, he went to each of the congressmen and senators that were visiting. They didn't want to rise and offer anything either, but McDonald, sitting with our representative, stood up and says, "Yes, I have something I'd like to offer. I'd like to ask a question." And the president, I forget who the president was at the time, but we could easily find out. It was about, it was shortly before McDonald died, whenever that was. Anyway, he asked the question, "Where are these reports going? I know they're not going to Project Blue Book. So where are they going?" Everybody looked away like that. They didn't want to answer it. Finally, the president looked around. Nobody wants to answer it. He didn't want to answer it either. He says, "Well, I don't know. We don't have that information. You'll have to brief the people over in the Pentagon, or go see them." So he didn't get his answer. He did cause some consternation in the cabinet. He came back from that feeling like he had scored a point, or picked a sore anyway, as far as the government was concerned. And it was shortly after that, only a few weeks after that, that he was suicided, when a pistol was put in his mouth and fired up in his head. That bullet went between the two brain halves, severed most of one optic nerve and part of another one, so he was essentially blind. He was in intensive care in St. Mary's Hospital in Tucson, in an intensive care ward, watched round the clock by nurses. He's in hospital clothes, recovering a garment that ties on the back and has no back in it. Hospital slippers. His clothes have been taken and locked up in a locker. And in the middle of the night, the first night that he's recovering from the gunshot wound, he disappears from the hospital. And they couldn't find him in the hospital, but the next morning they found him in the desert, 4 miles out of town, with another bullet from the into the left temple, across the head, and he's right-handed. The gun left at the site was his own, the doctor's own gun, Dr. McDonald's own gun. But that gun had to come from a shoebox on the second shelf of a closet, his clothes closet in his bedroom, where his wife was sleeping behind a locked door. The house door was locked, and he's in hospital clothes, and he's gone from St. Mary's Hospital to his home, probably 4 or 5 miles, at night in the dark in hospital clothes and hospital slippers, and successfully got in a locked door, into a locked bedroom, got the gun, got back out again, and went 4 miles out in the desert. Tell me that's suicide, but that's how he was reported. That's how it was classified. And his insurance was paid off, and his family told it was a suicide. So, is it a suicide, or was he suicided twice? Not once, but twice. People often ask me after a presentation, they say, "Well, where are they, and where do they come from, and what are they doing here?" And the answer is not a simple answer. It is not a simple they, and it's not a simple activity. And I have investigated over 100 cases in great detail where the aliens came back over and over to the same contactee and watched the changes in his life and the developments as they progress, and been able to measure and verify them. And in that 100 and some cases, I'll say, let's round it to 100, I have only found 2 cases that might be coming from the same place doing the same thing, and that was reticulum. The Betty and Barney Hill had an indication that after Marjorie Fisher's examination of the evidence that the astronomical configuration that she saw on the screen might have included reticulum, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 of reticulum. The aliens didn't tell her where they came from because they said, if you don't know where your sun is, what good will it do us to show you where we come from? So Marjorie Fish concluded that those came from reticulum, and they may have, because their appearance was very much like the ones that were contacting William Herman in North Charleston, South Carolina. Those little beings that are typically called grays today, and pretty much match the ones that were described by Barney Hill, told him that they came, specifically, that they came from a planet they call, from a planet that orbits one of twin suns that they call reticulum. And when we look at the constellation Reticulum, which means net, the net, we see 2 suns, big bright suns, together. And they told Herman, who is not an astronomer at all, that the 2 suns are twin suns that run parallel in sidereal space, which meant nothing to Bill Herman. So when I reported that to the astronomers at Kate Peaks, I laughed and says, there's no such thing as twin suns. In astronomy, there's no, every time there's 2 stars close together, they're binary. They become binary. He says that just the astrophysics makes them binary. So I said, well, watch these 2 and tell me if you can find out whether they're really twin suns running parallel in sidereal space, or if they're really binary. If they're binary, they must have a long period. So that was 15 years ago, and just recently one of the astronomers called me and said, you know, those 2 suns in reticulum do seem to be parallel suns, running parallel in sidereal space. They do not appear to be binaries, and they're changing the catalog to show this. Those reticulans told Bill Herman that they came from one of them, and that in their same sun system there was another planet that had evolved beings traveling in space. We've never met them. So that was a kind of a confirmation, but these were different. They're not humans like the Pleiadians. These are the other species. Now, there's an interesting study that was done in 1979. Both MUFON in the United States and CUFON, an equivalent in Canada, took all the known cases and plotted them and looked for comparisons. And they ran tables and graphs and charts, and they found, as a result of the study, it lasted months, that working from known data, they found that about 1/3 of the visitors to this planet were humans just like us. Different morphology, different appearances and so forth. Bigger ears, smaller ears, changing them out, bigger eyes, less hair, no hair at all on the body, but human creatures, placental human creatures like us, animals. Second category, a second third. The first third was humans. The second third was what we commonly call grays today, and the reticulans would fit in that category. There are a lot of grays. There's only one gray species that comes from reticulum, and that's often confused. But the second category being those gray types, they are non-placental creatures. You saw one on the autopsy table in the Santilli film. They don't have any gastrointestinal system. They don't have any sex organs. They are a different class of being altogether. We don't even know for sure whether they're animal or not. Now, this pretty much confirms the statements that the other statement I made earlier, that the nature of contact with this planet is infinitely varied. None of the species are the same. None of the humans are exactly alike. None of the grays are exactly alike, and all of the exotic different species are all different from each other. So that would also tend to confirm the fact that they all come from different planets, from different sources, and they have different technologies and doing different things. Yet they're intelligent enough to produce vehicles and be traveling in space. And that ought to be interesting. The possibilities are so vast. What their objectives are, I would have to believe from what I see that each one has his own game, that there is no common approach to the Earth species, that we're just another species that is being examined by different species because we are different from them in some degree. The humans are examining us because we're different humans. The other species because we're different creatures. And I don't see any peculiar pattern of contact here myself, because it appears that we're accidentally discovered by, there doesn't seem to be any program of contact to this planet except by a given species from a given planet at a given time. And there doesn't seem to be any organized relationship involving this planet that would indicate a major project of some kind by somebody. So I've got to believe that our planet, our sun even, is off in the boonies. It's not a part of a regular traffic system. We don't have regular visitors. The ones that find us are happenstance, and they appear here occasionally when they discover what appears to be intelligent life on this planet. And I find evidence in the way that develops that many of the alien visitors only encounter other alien visitors here. That space is so vast and the cosmos is so vast that they just don't encounter each other until they're both in the same place at the same time doing something related. So the Reticulans met the Pleiadians here. And they didn't know about them before that because there was no traffic with them. An ongoing program with at least one race and possibly more. And I got to tell you about a friend of mine, I won't give you his name, who was an engineer at Area 51. And if I give you any more about that, he'd be identifiable. But his job was an important job, and he spent a whole career there, retired from his job there. In about the 1960s, apparently our government made contact with an alien extraterrestrial visitor where they negotiated an arrangement to provide a surface facility for the aliens to operate from in exchange for some technology. And that's scuttlebutt all over the area, but there is some substance in fact. So when the agreement was reached, the alien society laid some requirements on our government. They said we would have to provide a suitable habitat for the beings that they would send here from their society. And they gave us some very specific instructions for it. The laboratory facility had to have 2 nozzles in the shower, one for water and one for enzymes. And they would bring enzymes from their home planet to be put in a tank to be dispensed through the second nozzle. The enzymes were lathed over the body first and rubbed in. They stand there for a time, and then they rinse off with water, and the water and the enzymes are collected at the bottom, and the enzymes are filtered out, put back in the tank, and the water is flushed away. That was one of the requirements. Another was a food requirement. They don't eat alimentation such as ours. They brought alimentation from their home planet that we had to learn to culture here in Area 51 to provide a food source for their diet. Our government was charged with the responsibility to produce the food from their products continually for alimentation for the guest visitors. Now those guest visitors arrived in an operational vehicle that they still keep operation of. They can go and come. They fly in and out of their habitat facility at will. They're not restrained in any way. But my engineer friend was one of the several engineers that were assigned to work with the extraterrestrials to try to bridge the gap between their technology and ours. And in 20 years of research trying to do so, they never succeeded in closing the gap. Were never able to convert that technology to ours. And the reason given by the aliens themselves is because in order to operate their equipment, they have to impart a certain mental input. And we have never learned to impart the input that's necessary to make the machines work. So their equipment responds to mind, to thought, and we have never learned to impart the proper thought to make any of it work. There is no way that we can bridge the gap with a wire from this point to that point, from theirs to ours, and make it work. There's no such wire. And that's interesting because those aliens I think one is very ill now and about to die, but they've been there since the 60s. That's for 35 years. And we've been trying to solve the problem all that time and haven't succeeded. That's one entity that I know about. There were 2 of them involved, 2 aliens involved, 1 craft. There may be others that I don't know about. That one I am quite sure is legitimate and real. The last I heard is one of those alien beings. We don't know whether they're males or females either because they don't have any sex organs. But they have not reproduced out there. They do go and come as they please, and sometimes they're seen by others outside or even in Area 51. They're not detained, but it's an interesting experiment because there may be other programs going on that are not as beneficent. Okay, my friend from Area 51 told me an interesting story about an event that happened out there. We had another crash come down about 8 miles north by northwest of Kingman, Arizona, at the old Kingman Air Base, northwest of Kingman Air Base. And that one was successfully recovered by teams from Area 51 using Area 51 equipment. There were 4 living aliens in that. All 4 of them were evacuated to Los Alamos, where they had already prepared a habitat for such events. And when they recovered, when the Area 51 team got the ship back to Area 51, it was beeping the whole time it was on the ground. When they got back to Area 51, it was still beeping. They couldn't figure out how to stop the beeping. And after a week of the irritating beeping that they just couldn't seem to turn off, somebody says, well, why don't we get the occupants to come back and turn it off? So they drove the occupants back from Los Alamos in a carryall to Area 51, indicated by sign language what they wanted them to do. They acknowledged and they said they'd have to go aboard. They didn't want to let them go aboard. They thought they'd take the ship off and fly away. But they finally consented. That's the only way they're going to stop it. They sent a guard in with them, and the guard came out vomiting before in just a few seconds. And the crew is in there together alone. Craft didn't start up and fly away. Probably couldn't anyway. They turned the sound off and came back to the door. The carryall backed up, and they loaded them, took them back to Los Alamos. Now, Los Alamos is involved, and that has been involved all along. So I'll tell you another story. My friend, the engineer, after 20 years of trying to solve the problem of bridging the gap between the technologies, is invited in 1968. Well, it wasn't 20 years by then. He was invited to Los Alamos for a project review conference. And they had about 18 scientists that all had been working on the project, various stages of the project, gathered around a big oval table in the Los Alamos headquarters with Edward Teller, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, sitting at the head of the table. One of the aliens on the opposite side of the table from my engineering friend put in a white shirt and slacks so he would look less alien, but he still had his alien bigger head, bigger eyes, black eyes. And he was sitting in the conference, and the only people that he could understand everybody else because he was telepathic. And the only way he could communicate, though, was with the signs that he had developed with my engineer friend to answer the question. But here's a man, an alien from another planet, sitting in a conference in 1968 in Los Alamos headquarters on the progress of learning how to bridge the gap between the alien technology and ours. It's a profound case that was thrown away when it came out. Everything was filed in the round file. None of the clubs had possessed it, so they didn't investigate it. They didn't do anything about it. They all knocked it. The government raised their usual programs of disinformation against it. The guy said that I don't need this. I have my own truth. I don't need to try to explain to people that I have to educate first before I can even tell them anything about it. To hell with it. So he wouldn't talk to anybody. He pulled in his horns, and his case continued. His contacts continued. They went on for a long time. He said he'd been taken to the moon twice since then by them and twice to their home planet. But he's not going to write anything on his visits to the home planet because they asked him not. When he came back from Switzerland, we had 8 stages of metal samples. They told us that their metal was synthesized from space, and that they in the mothership they collected space, primordial space, and they condensed it step by step until it was, and they stored it in matter banks. From that they could synthesize anything they need. So they would produce whatever they wanted from their synthesis banks. Now, the metals that they made were the result of their synthesis programs. So they offered to bring us 3 stages of metal for us to examine. And of the 3 states, one was a metal in a lower primary state before it was really specific. It was dark, almost amorphous. And they brought us another stage that was a little brighter, and then a stage that was quite bright, and then a stage that was bright goldish. And they told us each of these represented a successive stage of refinement to the useful form of metal that they used in their ships. We found that all of the metals involved, or all of the chemical metals involved, were highly electric. So we worried about they're all going to be soft. However, they said that their ships were protected by a force field. So the force field you would require high electrical conductivity to get good results for the force field. So this may be the result, maybe why they resorted to that kind of metal. Anyway, we got back and I took my specimens to the University of Arizona to the metallurgical department there, headed by Dr. Walter W. Walker. And he looked at them and he said, oh, these are interesting. He's also a member of APRO. He says, these are really interesting. I'd like to take a look at them. So he studied them a bit. When I went down to see him a couple days later, what did you find? Well, he said, we're going to have to take them to some other more advanced equipment than I've got here. He said, roughly they're one-third silver, one-third copper, one-third gold. But he said there's trace elements in there also. He said, however, you can't quote me. He said, I won't give you any writing on this. Now, you can't take a picture of the laboratory. They don't mention my lab and all that sort of thing, so not going to do us a damn bit of good. So I said, why not? He said, well, he said, this is an exotic subject. It's our business is not studying metal samples from a UFO. He said, take it elsewhere. He said, I'd recommend you get somebody that has some high-tech electronic scanning equipment. So we found a shop that had a laboratory that had that. And they gave us a little bit more information. They said that it is a strange metal. They said that it's a synthesis, that the metal shows that it is not synthesized from discrete metals mixed together or poured together. They said that on the electron scanning microscope, we get sharp spikes and a normal flow spikes down to where very low ones. They said this tells us that the metal is crossing has all of the metals in it, but larger quantities of some. So they said, we can't give you a report on this, so we're not in that kind of business. So then we finally found Marcel Vogel out at IBM, who was the inventor of the electronic data transfer. He's the one that invented magnetic tape and magnetic discs for computers. We took the metal to him, and he was very interested in it. He took it to the IBM laboratories to study it, and he come back with it. He studied for a week before he'd even talked to us, and then we were out there to see him, and he said, it's really a unique substance. He says, I agree that it's nothing we can make on this planet. He said, first of all, he said, it's not been in a molten state. He said, this is formed by a cold fusion process in a vacuum. He said, we have a cold fusion process, electrolytic, but he said it's not in a vacuum. He said, it's never been heated, there's no bubbles in it, and there's no ash. He said, so the assembly of this metal is rather unique. He said, when I turned a high intensity quartz beam on it, it began to dematerialize before my eyes, so I had to turn it off quick to keep from losing it. He said the crystal stacking in the metal, metal is made up of crystals, metal crystals. He said the crystal stacking in the metal is such that it's highly conductive. He says it's more conductive than any of those metals by themselves. And he said, I find trace elements of rhenium and thulium in them. He says those are unstable elements. By themselves, they quickly decay into something else, but they're stable in this alloy that you brought me. He said, so these trace elements may be doing something. He says, we make supermagnets by putting trace earths, rare earths in metal. And he says we get magnets that are 20,000 times stronger than ordinary magnets. He says these may be doing something like that, but we don't know. We don't have any laboratory work on it. He says it is highly electrical. He says it's highly conductive, all of it. But he said, yeah, it's mostly, roughly, it's copper, silver, and gold again. He gave us a television report, which is in a document we called the metal samples, that he would only do on video in his own laboratory. And he wouldn't give us anything on IBM stationery. He wouldn't give us anything on his own stationery. He says, I'm not afraid of the peer pressure, but because, as he said, I am the peer. But he said, this is not healthy for the company I work for. They don't like me doing this. So he said, I'll give you the television report as a private citizen. You can't show that I work for my bosses or anything else, and you may do what you want with it. So we put it in what we called, it was a video presentation, about 30 minutes of the metal sample. Oh yes, my interest was piqued in what was happening in Alaska, and they wouldn't let me have anything there, so I began So they wouldn't let me take anything home. They wouldn't let me learn anything what was happening in Alaska except what I was getting out of the interrogations. They wouldn't let me talk to anybody about it. Those were all highly classified. So I began watching the newspapers for any newspaper reports. I started buying magazines that had a UFO article in the magazine and collecting these. And from those I would get names and addresses. And I often called the people who wrote the articles to get them. Then I'd go interview those people myself, and if they took pictures, I'd try to get a copy of the picture, and frequently did. And then I began trading the pictures that I already had with other people that had pictures to get more pictures, and eventually built a library of pictures, probably the largest in private hands in the world. Is over 4,000 pictures of real UFOs. Now, if I can collect that many alone, as a single individual, working by myself, how many pictures do you think the government has got when every government employee is a potential investigator? Every agent on trained investigator, all collecting and contributing to the government file. They must have hangars full of pictures. At a international UFO conference in Acapulco, just like this. And I had gone down with Jim Lorenzen, who was the head of APRO, the first UFO civilian or civilian UFO research organization in the world, organized right here in Tucson. We flew down to Acapulco. Hynek had been invited to speak there. And we had dinner with Hynek the first night because he and Jim Lorenzen knew each other. And I found him to be an affable man. He didn't say much because he had learned not to commit himself on a position over the swamp gas and several other things that already happened by then. So when I came back from Switzerland with the photographs and the information that I was collecting in the Swiss case, I released some of the information in a meeting like this in Oakland, California one time. It was immediately attacked by everybody because they didn't have it, including all the clubs, including my own club in Tucson, APRO. They said that I stole their case. But I went there to find out about it myself for the first time. Anyway, I got a call a couple of years into the investigation of the case from a woman in Tucson, in Phoenix, asking me if I could come to Tucson and tell her about the Pleiades case. And I said, yeah, I can, but that's a little inconvenient. Is it important? She says, I think it's important. I think you'll find it important. So I agreed, and I drove up to Phoenix, and I met her in the afternoon. She said, come about supper time, we'll have a bite to eat. I got there about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I rang her doorbell, and she opened the door, and she said, there's somebody here I want you to meet. And she opened the door a little further, and there's Hynek standing there, and he greeted me. He said, hello. He said, come on in. And I went in, and he said, now I would like you to tell me something about this Pleiades case you're investigating. But he said, I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm not going to answer any questions. He said, I don't want to be committed in any way on this, but I'd like you to tell me what you know. So I showed him some of the pictures and told him something about the case, and he listened patiently, and we got through. He just thanked me, and I picked up my stuff and left. He never did really attack the Pleiades case, but everybody else all did because they weren't included in it. MUFON attacked me because we didn't include them in the investigation. Now, there's a reason why we didn't. I've never been a member of any UFO organization because they're always backbiting each other. So I tried to stay out of that, but I was closely associated with APRO because I knew Coral and Jim very well, and I used to help them put out their bulletin. I helped them file material in the office. I helped them in many ways because I was retired and had time to do it. Helped them prepare their newsletter. But they kind of turned against me when I came back with the Pleiades case and wouldn't turn it over to them. Now, the reason I didn't turn it over to them is none of these clubs had any money to investigate anything. They publish a little bulletin, their subscriptions to the bulletin barely paid for it, but they had no fund to send anybody anywhere to investigate anything. So I had to go on my own time and my own money, and I figured, if that's the case, why should I try to give it all to them? And it was going to take some serious research of the data that I was bringing. I had metal samples, I had plastic samples, I had a lot of things to be tested. And again, they had no money to do any of this. All of this is going to require money for testing. So I involved some other people with me to help finance some of the work that we were doing. So it was for this reason that most of the clubs now, the APRO began to publish attacks on the case in their own APRO journal, which I was helping them write. and they criticized the Swiss farmers, saying that he was a fraud and a fake, and that he might even be fooling some of our investigators, and a few things like that. So I quit coordinating information with them. I just decided I don't need all the problem. And they reached the stage where they even took my key away and wouldn't let me in the office anymore. I never would have gone back a second time on my own money or anybody's money if I had ever had any reason to suspect fraud or funny business in the case. When I got there, I found the most sincere, honest guy I ever saw. He looked you straight in the eye when he talked to you, looked right into your soul, and he didn't look away. When I asked him questions about making models and things like that, he showed me the models. He said, I can't make one. I have one arm. I can't cover anything. But he said, I do get models. His first one was from a 12-year-old neighbor boy in a shop class at school. He turned one out on a lathe, waxed it out, and brought it to him. He had it on his desk. He showed that one to me, and he says, others brought me other models. He said, yeah, they're models, but they're not the real thing. He says, models are easy to tell. So anyway, the case had a lot going for it. He had the best photographs I'd ever seen. And that's usually suspect. If the pictures are good, they're probably too good. But these stood all the testing that we could give them. And even over, more than 20 years of testing now, we haven't been able to find any way that they could have been faked. They're not montages, they're not double images, none of the regular things. Now we learned, in the process of testing these things, we learned a lot. We learned that we can take a still two-dimensional photograph, and by examining the photograph with computers and measuring pixels and everything else, we can find out if any object in the picture is moving, which direction it's moving, and about how fast, by counting the pixels on the edges. We found that we can estimate distance from the camera with respect to other objects in the picture by 6 different methods. One of them is haze factor, gray factor, color saturation, depth of field. Well, counting pixels is a good example. Also, that has to do with the dispersion of light over distance. The less sharp the field is, the further the light has traveled. So when we apply all 6 of those methods and find that the result is roughly within 10% of each other, and when we measured one of the pictures, for example, and found that the craft was hovering over a log pile 120 yards away, then knowing the geometry of the lens, we just simple mathematics, you can multiply it out and find that if that's 20 yards from the lens and it's that size in the image frame, then it's got to be 20 feet in diameter. And the witness was telling us it was about 7 meters in diameter, which is about 21 feet. So all of our tests came out like that. There are other tests for color shading, reflection of light from different sources around it. If it's a small model, it reflects it differently from a large object. And so there were people that come along and said, oh, he made them with models. We can make pictures just like that with models in 10 minutes. So there's a fellow, Michael Horn, that has taken the debunkers on out there in California, and he offered a lot of money for anybody that could duplicate just one picture. After a year with no duplications, he offered to, he said, well, you didn't do it with everything open. You had a freehand to do it any way you could, all the technicians you want, all the labs you want, in a laboratory if you like, and everything else. He said, now I'd like to narrow it down a little bit. He said the man had a broken camera. He couldn't change the focus. His focus was jammed just a little bit short of infinity, about a 32nd, a 16th of an inch maybe, short of the infinity focus on his camera. It had been dropped and the ring was bent and it was jammed. The same action broke the mirror loose beside the lens viewer, so he couldn't look through the camera anymore, and he had to shoot all of his pictures from the hip, so to speak. So then he said, and you should do it with all those settings. You should be stuck with the infinity setting, fixed focus, no lens. Another one. He shot everything at 125th of a second with his broken camera. All of it was shot on ASA 100 slide transparency film. He said, now I'd like to limit you to some of those. He didn't get anything for another year, and he said, well, you didn't do it that way. Now let's do it with one arm. This man has only one arm and besides his broken camera. Still no response, so he's ordered the people that offered money for anybody that can come up with a picture, he told them they ought to pay up, because Billy will make another one for them. I am absolutely convinced. I found other eyewitnesses. I didn't go around the neighborhood knocking doors wherever these things happened. And I found other witnesses that didn't know anything about Billy Meyer, and he didn't know anything about them, that had seen something descend into the woods nearby and rise from the woods 20 minutes later at the same time that Billy was having a contact. I found a man that was a computer programmer that lived on a hill overlooking one of the sites, and he had come home from work one day, saw the object slowly descending into the clearing behind the trees, landed behind the trees. He called his wife out. They both stood there and watched for 25 or 30 minutes until it rose in the air and flew away. They never heard of Billy Meyer, and Meyer never heard of them, but we found them just by knocking doors in the neighborhoods looking for anybody that had ever seen anything strange out there. And we found a number of them. Oh, I'm absolutely convinced that it's real. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever. And I went back 12 or 13 times. I lived in the household with the man and his family for 81 days overall, collectively. And I knew all of them very well. And I was there one day when I'd been there for 4 or 5 days already, living in the household with them, sleeping in one of the rooms in their bedrooms in their house. When he got up one morning, it'd been raining all the day before and the night before, and he got up, it was wet and soggy outside, and he had a cold, he thought he was coming down with the flu. He was a heavy smoker and he didn't light a cigarette. He drank a lot of coffee, he didn't take coffee. He walked around a little bit, went and laid down on a sofa in the living room in front of the television set. Stayed there all day long. He didn't feel like getting up. He hadn't drunk any water. They brought him water and he didn't drink it. He didn't drink coffee, he didn't smoke. And by about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I hear him, I'm watching the television with my back to him, and I heard a movement. And I looked around and he's down there like this, motioning for me to come over. So I went over there and bent down to see what he had. He said, "Get Elsie." So I went to get Elsie. She was one of the women in the household there. And she came and did the same thing, and he told her something, and she went to get his wife, and between the two of them, they picked him up and walked him down the hallway to his bedroom. They evidently put him in a tub, because for every contact he had, he changed all of his clothes from the inside out, wearing all fresh clothes, having taken a bath if he had time, just before leaving. So they left his underclothes in there, and his wife came out with a shirt and jeans, which he always wore. And she put up the ironing board and started ironing those, and Elsie brought the boots out and started washing those, scrubbing them up, then polished them and set them aside. Then he came walking out. His wife took the shirt and pants in. He came walking out with the shirt and pants on, and she took the empty sleeve and pinned it up for him. And Elsie had laid out his pistol, gun, and a walkie-talkie, and he sat down at the table, and he took the pistol out of the holster, opened the barrel, dumped the cartridges out, looked down the barrel at both, and put them all back in, put it back together, put it in the holster, strapped it on. Then he took the walkie-talkie, opened it up, dumped the batteries out, put fresh batteries in it. No matter how bad the other batteries were, I thought this might be a waste of equipment. Maybe it will work, but he didn't want to take any chances on it not working. They'd had problems already with it, for lack of that. So they had learned how to prepare for the meeting. So now he's all ready to go, and he's dressed, and it's about 6 o'clock in the evening. This all started about 5:30. Well, it's probably closer to 6:30. The men had come in from work, had seen what was going on, went and washed up and came back, sat down at the table. The women had served them supper, and Billy and his wife and Elsie are standing at the end of the table by the stove, cook stove. Over the stove was a clock with a round face with big numbers on it. And I'm on the far end of the kitchen pouring a cup of coffee. When he raised his hand and a little signal like that, he got the final word to go telepathically and started out the door. I set my coffee cup down so hard I spilled it, ran around the table, following him out. I want to see him go this time. So I've never been able to catch him this close to a departure. And I got out the kitchen door, which went down 2 steps to the ground, and a lean-to shed that went to the end of the house with a spring-loaded door that opened inward. So I got on the ground out there in time to see his heels going through the end door, and I ran about 8 or 9 steps to it, jerked it open. I don't want to miss anything, and there out in the wet ground, in the mud, was 1, 2, 3 steps like that, no fourth step. And so I looked all around. There's no noise, no lights, it's quiet, the rain is still falling. And I thought, gee, and I missed it. And so I stayed out there in the rain until I got soaking wet. And I went back in to change clothes, and I put dry clothes on, and somebody gave me a raincoat, and I was going back out I didn't want to miss anything. I'm going to be there when he comes back. And as I came down the stairs, I saw in the living room the Germans are standing in front of the television set watching it. So I went over and looked over their shoulder to see what they're watching, and there was a black screen with a white cross that said in German, "The Pope has died." So I said, how did he die? And they said, we don't know. The program just stopped and this came on the screen. I watched for maybe 30 seconds or more, but I don't want to miss what's going on outside. So I went back outside in the rain to wait for Billy to come back. And I was out there about 15 or 20 more minutes when a telephone rang and somebody answered it upstairs, and they raised the window and said, he's down over at Elg and you can go with Jacobus and his wife to pick him up. Well, Elg was on the other side of the mountain. His walkie-talkie is line of sight, so he had to use a telephone to call home. He walked from wherever they let him out, probably right in front of a guest house. When we got in a black Volkswagen, splish and splash through puddles, rain splashing all over the windshield and over the top of the car, trying to get to him. And he had gone out in the rain, and now we're going to pick him up, still in the rain, someplace else. He's standing under one of those little 3-board roofs over a 3-step landing on the side of a guest house, which is closed for the night. And he's not wet. Doesn't have any raindrops on his jacket. His hair is dry. His shoes only had a little bit of mud around the soles, nothing on the top. You know, if you walk on a muddy street, you get mud on the top and everything everywhere. He didn't have any of that. So he got in the car, and trying to make conversation, he just looked forward. He didn't want to talk, and I tried several times. I just gave up and leaned back. We got back to the house. It took us about 15 minutes to go each direction. And they went inside, and he walked into the living room. The Germans followed him in there, closed the door. So I knew that they were going to get whatever information he wanted to tell them, and that I probably wasn't invited at that stage. I waited a couple hours, never did open up, so I went up and went to bed.
My name is Jim Mars. I'm a journalist from Texas, have a degree in journalism. I work for a number of Texas newspapers, even tried owning a couple. The problem is I got into more and more controversial and exotic subjects. I found myself a journalist without a journal. There is definitely very tight control over the flow of information in certain topics through our corporate control mass media. They seem to take it upon themselves to be the gatekeepers of information. Part of this information that they are keeping from us is the just absolutely immense wealth of information concerning the UFO phenomena, and the fact that it can be tracked and documented all the way back through history, all the way back to the Bible with Ezekiel and the flaming wheel in the air, you know, flying through the sky. Hello. And so it's been with us all along. The problem has been since the early 50s, and I have the government documents. The United States government has instituted a policy of denial and control over the information. Nothing happening there, folks. Nothing happening there, folks. And if somebody persists in saying, but I saw it, then they're ridiculed. Oh, they've got a screw loose. Something's not right with them. And I think this is absolutely just unconscionable in a country that pays lip service to freedom and individual liberty, because there have been so many people whose lives have been wrecked, whose families have been wrecked, because of this policy of denial and ridicule over a phenomena that has happened worldwide for centuries. It's just something that we're in denial about, pushed along by this government program. But the good news is it's starting to crack apart. In England, for example, top government officials have acknowledged that we are being visited by craft from somewhere else, and that there are people not from this planet. And what was really interesting, and I think should serve as a template for how to handle these things. In Mexico, the defense minister actually handed over to the national media gun camera film from fighter interceptors that were using infrared, And although they didn't see anything, it picked up, I think, 6 or so UFOs, trailing them and moving around in an intelligently guided manner. Now, this is the type of openness, this is the type of let's share information with the public, let's find out what's going on, that is sadly lacking in the United States. But I think because of this increasing openness in other countries, we're now seeing this wall of censorship cracking apart in the United States. The Robinson panel of the 50s and the Operation Blue Book, Project Blue Book of the 60s were not really scientific-based investigations. They were just public relations efforts to try to get people not to be thinking about UFOs. So in other words, all you folks out there who are old enough to have seen all the newspaper reports on the Robinson panel and hear what Blue Book said, it was just hogwash. Never mind. It's amazing, and but this seems to be the way. This is the way the status quo protects itself. They just can't allow information to come out overnight so people would be perturbed and actually demand that something be done about it. They stonewall it, deny it, lie about it for 30, 40 years, and then finally just announce it as if it's fact, and everybody goes, yeah, okay, because they already knew this anyway. In fact, this network special, to my mind, reminded me of the old line about, hey, wait for me, I'm your leader. Okay? They did some pretty good jobs of detailing some of the major recent UFO things in the United States, the Phoenix flyover and the policemen chasing this thing through Missouri. But this was all years later. My immediate thought was, and they were interviewing the people involved, they were showing, reenactments and recreations of what had gone on, and it was pretty compelling. But why didn't they tell us that when it happened? Isn't that what the news media is supposed to be doing? And so it's really funny. But it's also sad, but it's also encouraging, because this wall of science is cracking open. Now let me explain to you why this wall of science has been there. It's not that they really care that we know that aliens and ETs exist. What you have to understand is the United States government, the leader of the free world, is totally controlled by a wealthy oligarchy. A small handful of people that are just super rich. Most of them are not even in government, but they tell the government what to do. These are the people who are behind the UFO secrecy. They don't care if you know there's ETs out there. But if you know there's ETs out there, then you will know that there is alternative technology. And this could upset their monopolies over energy, fuel, transportation, communications, pharmaceuticals. And that's what they don't want. After all, who would continue to pay all these ever-increasing prices for gasoline that's polluting the air, choking us all, killing our kids? Why would we do that if we knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that there was non-polluting energy sources out there? This is what it's all about. It comes back to the old journalistic adage, follow the money. The study of UFOs, or ufology as they sometimes call it, I have watched with great interest how that has progressed over the years. Back in the 50s, the big question was, do they come from Mars or do they come from Venus? And by the 60s and 70s, we had gotten a little more sophisticated in our intellect and our thinking, and the question became, well, do they come from Alpha Centauri or Zeta Reticuli 4, Well, and then now we're up to today, and we've got even more sophisticated, and now the question is, do they come from another planet, or do they come from another dimension? Or are they perhaps time travelers? Do they come from another time, okay? And in my study of all of this, I have kind of come to the conclusion that the answer is yes. All of the above. I think that there are various groups and individuals, species, who from time to time come and visit this planet, zoop around. And I think that to try to ascribe any one particular motive to them is tantamount to us looking up at the air at a Boeing 767 aircraft and saying, are those people good or bad? You know, you just can't ask that. It's a group of people, a group of intelligent beings. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But I will say this, I don't think there's any reason for great fear and anxiety, because the historical record is plain. This has been a phenomenon that's been around since our recorded history. The Vedas, the Hindu Vedas, which are among the oldest writings in the world, talk about the flying Brahmas and how that they were used to launch weapons and blow up cities and all this stuff. You know, again, we've got Ezekiel, and it just goes all the way back. So they've been here all along. If their game plan was like an Independence Day type invasion where they're going to blow up everything and eat everybody or whatever, it would have happened long before now. If their purpose was to invade the earth, it would have happened in 1947, when all we had to resist them would have been propeller-driven airplanes and machine guns. And now we have, you know, laser technology, scalar weapons, electromagnetic beam weapons, space platforms, and they still haven't done it. So I don't think there's any reason at all for a lot of fear and hysteria. Back in the early 90s, they were clearing some rainforest in Brazil, and they came across the Caribo tribe, which was a Stone Age, still living in the Stone Age. Now, in years past, we were so sociologically primitive that we would have just rushed in there and said, here's some clothes, put them on, here's some Bibles, get religion, here's a gun, you know, you can hunt, and we would have essentially destroyed their culture. This time, we were a little bit more sociologically advanced. They actually quarantined the area, not to keep them in, but to keep others out. And then they formed a team of scientists, anthropologists and sociologists, and they had a pool, and they sent these scientists down there, and they conditioned this tribe to their presence. They let themselves be seen from a far distance up on a hillside or something, and they'd kind of wave to them, you know, and then after some days went by, they would get a little closer, and finally they'd be just across the clearing from them, and they'd hold their hands up and they'd wave, and they'd show that they were non-hostile, non-threatening, until finally they made contact with the tribe. And even at that point, what they wanted to do was study the tribe to find out what Stone Age societies lived like. And I think about the only thing, they did go so far as to give them some metal knives to make their life a little bit easier, you know. And you can imagine that these people went, wow, a steel knife, you know, this is magic, okay? The purpose of that story is that they were conditioned to accept this highly technological advanced race, which is us. I feel we have been undergoing a similar conditioning program since at least the 1940s to condition us to accept the reality of the extraterrestrial presence. And it's been quite successful. Polls in the United States in the 1950s showed virtually no one believed that there was any life outside the Earth. And yet today, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Peter Jennings said that their polls showed something like 85% now say, yes, I believe there is life outside this planet. So we are getting very close, I feel, to actually breaking this whole thing open and accepting the reality of life outside this planet. When I was a youngster in school, we were told the moon was just a dead world, just a rock, nothing there. And now we're being told, well, there is a little thin atmosphere and there's winds that blow across the moon, and oh yeah, we found water on the moon. And the same thing's happening with Mars. Oh, that was a dead world. Oh, well, we did find these polar caps. Yeah, it was probably frozen methane. No, now we find it's water. And now we find there's an underground lake on Mars that's got all, you know, and something tells me they've probably found some sort of primitive life. They just haven't announced it yet, but they will. And we're being slowly conditioned to understand that there is life outside this planet and that we probably live in a universe and a galaxy teeming with life. Now, so what is their purpose? They are conditioning us to understand this because I feel like that, like in Star Trek, there is a prime directive. Now, I'm unclear on whether this is a law with enforcement capabilities or simply a general understanding. But it is a thought held by all of the thinking beings in the universe that it is not proper to interfere with God's natural evolution of a species. So they are prohibited, either self-control or by maybe some imposed law, from directly impacting on us and directly contacting us and giving us weapons, giving us technology that would interrupt our natural evolution. But yet I think, especially because of the onset of the whole UFO phenomena beginning about 1946-47, and that I don't think it's coincidence that that coincided with our development of nuclear weapons. And I think that out in the universe, they were horrified. They said, "Oh my God, the kids have found the matches." Well, they don't want us to destroy ourselves, and they don't want us to destroy this planet, and yet they're prohibited from directly intervening in our affairs and in our evolution. So I think that we've got crop circles and animal mutilations and abductions and sightings and increasing sightings and all like that, so that it's not directly impacting on us, and yet over this conditioning period we are coming to understand that we're not the only ones in the universe. And I think they're trying to kind of boost us up the evolutionary ladder so that we can grow to be full-class members of the intergalactic community instead of destroying ourselves through our petty bickering wars and nuclear holocaust. I completed a documentary on one of the most fascinating investigations that I've ever been involved in my years as a journalist. It involves an area east of the little town of Deer Lodge, Montana, known as Red Gate. And this was named after a gate that at one point had been painted red but had mostly faded, but it was known as Red Gate. This was the teenage parking spot. This is where you would take your date to go up in the mountains and park, and it already had a legend for being a spooky and creepy place. In fact, an urban legend grew up about it that the gate was red because somebody murdered his entire family and smeared their blood on the gate. Well, we went up to Deer Lodge. One of the first people I talked to was the sheriff, and he confirmed that there had been no murder up in this area. So the story of the murder and the blood on the gate was just an urban legend. But then he himself said, but he had had lots of reports of strange activity in this area, and that it mostly concerned UFOs. And then he gave us the names of some people in town, including the local baker, Louis Manacucci. And Louis and his family had lived up in this Red Gate area, and they had some wild stories of seeing these ships that would rise up out off the mountain at night, of animal mutilations. His own dog had a huge piece taken off of his back, and when they took him to the vet, they couldn't even sew it together because it was so wide. They wanted to know what happened to the rest of the hide, and this happened twice. So some neighbors had animal mutilations, and it was quite incredible. And so we began to dig into this little town, and we found that in this one small little American town of 3,000 people, within a week and a half, we'd gotten more than 30 signed releases from people who said they had had ongoing UFO experiences dating all the way back to 1950. Now that's amazing. And it prompted me to wonder how many other towns in America have had this similar situation, but nobody wants to talk about it. And again, because of the denial and ridicule factor. But the thing that I think was most fascinating about the investigation of Red Gate, and that I think people should pay attention to, because I think this may give you the methodology for looking into these stories. If you have someone who says, I was abducted and they floated me through the window and I went up in a ship and they took me here and they probed me and they et cetera, that's interesting, but it's just a narrative. And your choice is, do you believe this person or do you not? And of course, this leads to the big controversy over the abductions, because some people say, well, I believe them. Others say, no, I don't believe them. You know, they're making it up or they were daydreaming or whatever. Well, we set about to try to find out what really happened. And there was a fellow named Bill Kelly. All he remembered consciously was that as a young teenager, he was with his brother and another guy. They were driving down a dark road late at night, and this light chased them. And I said, well, you know, what happened to it? He said, well, it just went away. All right, we subjected him to polygraph, the lie detector test. Everyone we had take the lie detector showed no signs of deception. So everybody was telling what at least they believed to be the truth. Bill Kelly, no exception. Then we sat him down, got his conscious recollection. Yeah, this light came and it was really strange and we were freaking out and it just went away. Then we put him under hypnosis. And we get more details. We find out, no, it didn't just go away. It hovered over the car. They stopped the car. His friends were saying, don't get out, don't get out. But he got out, okay? But then he got very emotional and he got very hesitant. And that's about all we could learn under the hypnosis. So then we turned to the CIA tested and Army used techniques of remote viewing. We had 8 remote viewers who took a look at this, and one of them pretty well typified what they found was, because they drew a car, they drew a big saucer-shaped object with a cone, and these 3 guys rising up through the cone. They had been taken up on the ship, but they had had their memories of this wiped. Okay, so that was one. I think the most miraculous thing, and I have to tell you this because it'll give you a good example of the power and the penetration investigative technique of remote viewing. One of the stories involved a young boy and his sister. And the young boy, who of course is now a middle-aged man, consciously remembers going outside of their ranch home near Deer Lodge into the woods and visiting their little gray friends. His sister did not remember this consciously, but under hypnosis, she too talked of going into the woods and visiting with their little gray friends. Polygraph showed no signs of deception, so we get to the remote viewing. The question was, what really happened to these kids in 1950? So that question was put to an administrator who then attached that question to a number, a 2 4-digit number, an 8-digit number that represented the question. What happened to these kids? He takes the number, just the number, and turns it over to a tasker. The tasker has no idea of what this is all about, what the question is, what the context is. He simply has the number, which he passes to a monitor. The monitor has no idea what the question is, what the topic is, what anything is about this. He only knows their target is this number. He then takes the number and passes it to 8 separate remote viewers who live in different cities and different states. This was all done by email and telephone. When they have the opportunity, they sit down and they do a remote viewing. All of them were trained and certified by some of the military trained remote viewers. They have a track record. We know these are good tested remote viewers. They sit down and they look at the target. All they have is this number. That's their target. Go look at this. What's this? Okay. And they mentally focus and they go to the target, and all 8 then send their raw data back into the monitor, who sends it to the tasker, who summarizes things and sends it back to the administrator, and then we get our response back. Now, they all saw some different aspect of this, but it blew me away. All 8 essentially said these were 2 small children who went into the woods near their home and met with aliens. It's just astounding. I mean, even if that's some sort of a made-up thing, even if they're reading minds or something, you know, that's just as extraordinary as the fact that they're able to go and use a number to go to this particular event, and that 8 separate people agree on what happened in that event. So I'm hoping that this type of methodology to be used in investigations of this type will become, you know, a template for the use in the future to investigate such stories.
I arrived in the summer of 1963, received an assignment to Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers in Europe, which at that time was located in Paris. When I arrived, my top secret clearance was upgraded to cosmic. which would allow me to work in the war room. And I was assigned to the operations division, which operated what we called the war room, the operations center. And I suspect you're familiar with how operations centers and war rooms work. It's the center of control for the entire military operation. And our operation in those years was from the tip of Norway in the north to the southern tip of Turkey in the south. That's what they called the NATO-shaped theater of operations. As you know from your history, and I'm sure you're aware, that Europe was divided in those days. Right down the middle, Germany was divided. You had the Soviet Warsaw Pact in the east, and then you had the NATO-shaped military alliance on the west. And that was what we called our theater of operations. I arrived in the summer of '63, and I immediately became aware, because of gossip, and the military gossips as much as anybody else. There was talk in the war room about a study that was underway. And this study had became initiated in 1961 as a result of an event that occurred early February in 1961, where a flight of unidentified objects were flying from the Soviet sector to the east over the Warsaw Pact, toward the west over the NATO lines. These objects were very high, they were very fast, they were in formation, they appeared to be circular in shape, and they were obviously under intelligent control. They came in a formation of, well, what appeared to be almost 100 of them. And they flew in formation at a high rate of speed from the east over NATO, over the Channel, southern coast of England, where they turned, flew north, and disappeared from NATO radar over the Norwegian Sea. Well, all hell broke loose in the war room. We found out that the Soviets had gone on alert, the Warsaw Pact had gone on alert because they picked them up. All of our Air Force and radar sensory devices picked them up. NATO thought those objects belonged to the Russians. We found later that the Russians thought they belonged to us. Both forces were to find out later that they didn't belong to any of us, that they belonged to somebody else. And of course the big question is, who the hell do they belong to? Who are they? What are they? Where are they from? They demonstrated incredibly high technology. There were not jets. There were no contrails. They were circular. They were metallic. And they were in formation. They moved, obviously, under intelligent control. And so NATO shape, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers, initiated a study in 1961, which was underway when I arrived in '63, to determine what the hell these things were. The conversation in the lunchroom, at the Nafi cafeteria, during breaks, coffee breaks and all, UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Who, what, where, when, how, you know. Well, they published the study in the summer of 1964, a year after I arrived. They concluded that these were extraterrestrial. After a pretty thorough 3-year military study, they made conclusions based on many in-depth research studies that they conducted, and they were thorough. It was a military study designed. Let me give you some background here. The subject that this research study was called an assessment. It had a subtitle of an evaluation of a possible military threat to Allied forces in Europe. Not a word about UFOs, just an evaluation of a possible military threat. When they finally published it, it was about, 6 inches thick. But it was supported by 10 inches of annexes and appendices. A copy, I found out, you could read the distribution on the front of the thing. Copy number 1 went to the Secretary General of NATO. Copy number 2 went to my boss, General Lyman Lemnitzer, an American 4-star general who was known as SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Copy number 3 went into the vault in Shock, Supreme Headquarters Operations Center, the War Room. That was the one that I had access to. I used to work on shifts. Matter of fact, I ran the shifts. I maintained the duty roster for all the officers and enlisted men in there. I was a master sergeant at the time. And it was one of my jobs to maintain the duty roster of who was on shift. Our shift commander was almost always what we call an 06, either a bird colonel in the Air Force or a captain in the Navy or a bird colonel in the Army, Warring Eagles, 06 they call it. And if he was a British officer, he was a wing commander, same basic grade. So I ran the duty roster for them, and I worked in there myself on shifts. And back in those days, we were on 12-hour shifts. And you get into that damn war room, sometimes at 2 and 3 in the morning. The teletype machines were quiet, the phones weren't ringing, nothing was really going on. It was boring as hell. And the coffee was so strong you didn't want to drink any more of it. You know, you'd sit on the hot plate and get black, and you'd twiddle your thumbs and you'd sit around and read yesterday's newspapers and such. Well, when this document was finally published and the copy was put into the vault, I was sitting there one morning, bored to death, and the bird colonel, the Air Force colonel, who was the controller, that's what we call the shift commander in the war room, a controller. He had this thing on his desk, and he brought it over and he threw it on mine, and he says, "Read this. This will wake you up." So I go through the thing. An assessment, an evaluation of a possible military threat to Allied forces in Europe. Okay. I figured he had some purpose of wanting me to look at it. I turned the page. And I started reading this thing. And I'll tell you, Robert, that was the beginning for me. Because once I read it, once I went through the annexes and the appendices, and once I had seen the photographs, once I had read the autopsy reports, once I had studied the historical annex, which was incredibly thorough. I mean, they had some first top-rate minds working to put this thing together. It stimulated my curiosity, my imagination. It triggered something in me that I've never been able to put to rest. It was the beginning of my dedication to research this matter. The study itself was 3 years, from 61 to 64. I was to find later that most of the conclusions in that study were known by the United States intelligence agencies and the United States Air Force from far beyond, back into the early 50s, that they had learned and knew most of what the SHAPE study concluded. But I wasn't to learn that until later, until I'd had other assignments and delved into other classified files and talked to people. But as an introduction for me, it was a stunning experience. It was mind-boggling. It was an eye-opener that, to try to be brief, I can't possibly give you the entire study. I must have read it a dozen times. Every time I was in on duty, I'd pull it out of the vault and go through it. Reread it, reread, read the annexes, go through, look at the autopsy photographs. my life changed and I was never ever quite the same. So the study itself was not as complete as it could have been, but they concluded what they wanted to conclude. One, there was not a threat involved. Two, they weren't the Soviets. Three, they were obviously, from what they concluded, the evidence was overwhelming, they were extraterrestrial. Four, there were 4 groups involved, 4 different groups. And they were all humanoid, but they were not human. Only one of the 4 was what we considered to be human. One group out of the 4 looked so much like us. I mean, almost identical to us. They could have put on these guys could have put on a suit and tie. And for the females, because we encountered some of them as well, they could have put on a dress, suit and tie, coat, jacket, sit down with you, next to you in a restaurant, sit next to you in a theater, and you'd never know. And that bothered the military security analysts. The intelligence guys were really bothered by that there could be an extraterrestrial race in our midst. Some of the small talk back in those days, one bird colonel one day was saying at lunch, you know, Jesus Christ, these guys could be walking them down the corridors of shape here. At that time we were located outside of Paris, at a little town called Roquencourt. And it was the Supreme headquarters there. It was not an elaborate, fancy kind of thing. They've got one of those now out in Brussels. Multi-million-dollar facility, but back in those days, the headquarters was not that impressive. The point I'm making is that he says, you know, they could walk up and down the corridors of Satan, we'd never know. And a major said, you know, Colonel, they could walk up and down the corridors of the Pentagon and we'd never know. And then some smart ass, I forget who it was, some lieutenant colonel, and we dined together back in those days. The senior NCOs, the senior enlisted personnel, we worked so closely with the commissioned officers that we not only worked together, but we often dined together at the British NAFI cafeteria. And another one said, you know, bastards could be in the White House. We wouldn't know. And there was a little forced laughter there, you know. And then we concluded, no. The gang in the White House are not smart enough to be from some other planet, you know. Anyhow, we had to laugh because the study made an impact on all of us. We had an air deputy by the name of Robert Lee, an Air Force 4-star general who was General Lemnitzer's air deputy. He had an air deputy, he had naval deputies, he had Army ground deputies. He had a staff of a couple of hundred working for him, a mixed staff. British, West German, our ex-enemies were now our best friends. You know, we were Italians on the staff. At that time we had French on the staff. That was before de Gaulle withdrew from the NATO. Well, he didn't withdraw from NATO, but he withdrew from SHAPE. The staff was mixed in those days. You know, it was 15 nations. The Turks, the Greeks, the French, we were all involved. When the study was published, 15 copies only. Copies went to, to most of the major players there. But it affected everybody. General Lee was particularly affected. He was a hell of a fine man. He was a hero from World War II. He was a command pilot. He commanded Air Force units all over Europe. His aide told me, he said, the old man looked at this thing and he threw it across his desk and he says, do you know what that means? He says, that means that everything we've got, everything we've done, all of our technology, it means nothing. He was deeply affected by the conclusions in the report. It opened his eyes to a point where he recognized that the world, his world, will never be the same. And of course, the world isn't the same. But most people in the world are still asleep. They have no idea what's going on. They have no idea what we're facing here. But I want to tell you that I do not believe there's going to be disclosure because the subject is so damn vast. It's so incredibly overwhelming that the average guy out there, I don't believe, is ready for it. You know, as I said, if you simply visits from guys from other planets, as shocking as that might be, they could take it. Other stars, that would shake up some of our scientists who says you can't get there from here or here from there, but they would eventually accept it. Other galaxies, only a few of the advanced quantum physicists would be able to understand that. Other dimensions? Only now are scientists like Michio Kaku, the brilliant physicist in New York, is beginning to talk about multiple dimensions, like the one we are in. Kaku says there could be 10 or 11 of them. So now it's slowly beginning to happen, but that's not the reason for the cover-up. The cover-up is being maintained and will continue to be maintained for three basic reasons, I think. Economic, because if the truth were to come out and the knowledge, the fact that we now have some of the goodies that they have in energy sources, 0-point energy is the point I'm trying to make here. If that were to come out, the world economy would collapse because our economy is based on oil right now. You cannot introduce another energy system without shaking up the whole house of cards, you see. All right, that's one reason why the lid is still being kept on. The other is sociological, is that there are a lot of people who are not prepared to accept, good God, they can't accept black neighbors down the street. They can't accept a Muslim family who just moved in. They can't accept, you know, somebody from Mexico who doesn't speak English. How in the hell are they going to accept intelligent humans, humanoids, races from other planets, other stars, other galaxies that don't look like them at all? Of course, you've always got the one group that looks exactly like us. How do you tell them they could be sitting next to you in the restaurant? You're disturbing their paradigm, you see? You're upsetting their apple cart, and they don't like that. You cannot upset someone's apple cart without he either gets out of his chair and slaps the hell out of you, you know, or throws rocks through your window or something. The last reason, and I have always believed it's probably the major reason for the cover-up, are the theological implications. How do you tell? How do you tell a Southern Baptist, a fundamentalist, a Christian who fears and dislikes Muslims, who fears and dislikes Catholics, who fears and dislikes Hindus, don't trust them? How do you tell a Christian fundamentalist, let alone a Muslim fundamentalist, whom many of them are dangerous as hell, as we know, how do you tell these people that practically every major religion on this planet had its origin as a result of activities, programs from advanced extraterrestrial intelligence? How do you tell a Christian fundamentalist that that beautiful young man from Galilee 2,000 years ago, that his birth, his life, his death, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension, the transfiguration was all real and it all happened, but it was orchestrated by an advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. How do you get that word out to people? You don't, because they're not ready for it yet. Now, do you see what I'm trying to say? Why this is the greatest story in human history? How do you tell people that you and I and we, all of us, are genetic hybrids? That we are not the product of evolution? Evolution is real, it exists, it happens. But human beings, there have been what many of the scholars are saying, interference, intelligent interference in the development of the human genome. That the human being today, what we call Homo sapiens sapiens, the thinking ape, we are a hybrid and we have been genetically manipulated into who and what we are by advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. There are people who are not ready to hear that. Most traditional Darwinists are not ready to hear that. But there has been intelligent intervention, and we've got proof. One of the things I neglected to say is that we now have a rather intimate, ongoing relationship with one of those groups. Group it is, whether it's the one that look exactly like we are, or we do, or whether it's one of the others. But our black government, not the one you're familiar with. The average American is familiar with, the executive, legislative, judicial, We elect congressmen, we elect senators, we go through the whoop-de-doo every 4 years, we go through the whoop-de-doo every 2 years for the House. That's not the government. The government is different, it's separate, and it's completely black. You can't tell that to people either because they don't want to hear it. They're not ready to accept the idea that their government is not the government they thought they had. They're not ready to accept, even though the evidence has been released, that there's $100 billion of their tax money that's black budget money every year where there's no accountability. Now, Congress ought to be hung up and dried. Those guys are guilty of a crime. I call it criminal negligence, because one of their jobs is to monitor the budget, to monitor the expenses of your tax money. But there's $100 billion, it may be more now, but there's $100 billion of your tax money annually that's unaccountable. No audits, no accountability. Senator Joe Smo can't go up to somebody in the budget department and say, where the hell is this money going? Well, if he gets an honest answer, they'll say, well, Senator, we can't tell you. Or if he gets a typical answer, he says, well, Senator, we don't know. It was in the newspapers here a year ago. I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but the Department of Defense lost $500 billion in 2 years that they couldn't account for. Now, this is not the $100 billion of black budget money that goes to black programs. They lost $500 billion and couldn't account for it and had the gall to admit it. You see, anyhow, I get off in these tangents because this really ticks me off. Oh, I've learned so much that, it really is, it's tainted my attitudes a bit. But here I am. I've learned quite a bit. And I've learned things I probably wish the hell now I didn't know. I like the old song, I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then. But you can't you can't unlearn things that you've learned. And I have no one to blame but myself, because I went after it and dug into it, insisted I find out, wanting to know. We live in a universe, apparently, that's teeming with intelligent life. I mean teeming with it. Planets, star systems, solar systems, everywhere. Life forms from the lowest level to probably the highest level, which we would refer to as a divinity, maybe. People are not ready for that yet. It's going to take another few years. It's going to take some more schooling. It's going to take what I always said was an expansion of human consciousness. And one of the reasons I spoke out, and still have speaking out like I am with you, is that I have always believed that understanding some of this, becoming aware of some of this, opening your heart and mind to this, would bring about an expansion of human consciousness, which might bring us together as a species and as a race, because we are all the same. We are all brothers, cousins. We're all the same family. And we've got to stop this stupid killing and these absurd wars. And we've got to come together. Or we might literally annihilate ourselves from this sweet planet. And if we don't do that, we're going to make this planet so unlivable that nobody will want to live on it, because we have the capability of doing that. But there is another factor at work here. One is, some of these groups appear to have, I don't know whether you would call it a custodial attitude toward us, to the planet and to the species, because they have been continually genetically manipulating us for some time. That manipulation is still underway. It's the answer, it's the solution to the abduction problem, which many people are now beginning to take seriously and to pay attention to. A dear friend of mine who died hit by a drunken driver in London, Professor John Mack from Harvard, had written a book called Abductions, where John was a psychiatrist at Harvard, a tenured professor at Harvard, a man of tremendous intellect and a man of great spirit and soul, had concluded that the abduction phenomenon was a result of an ongoing genetic manipulation. So these groups that are interested in us, at least seem to show some benevolence, I think would probably step in and keep us from blowing the hell out of ourselves if push come to shove. If we had time, I would tell you stories where they have interfered at American intercontinental ballistic missile bases, at Soviet ICBM bases, where they have made their presence known, where they have indicated subtly, overtly, scaring the hell out of these guys, that they're there and they're paying attention. Incidents happened in the Soviet Union before it collapsed. Incidents happened all over the northern US at ICBM bases, where they came down, hovered over the silos, and played hell with the electronics. Pictures were taken. Hundreds of witnesses watched them. It's highly classified. You'll never hear that, except from whistleblowers and big mouths like me. So you see, we're dealing with a big, big story. It's not just them. As I said, if it was that simple, it would probably been out some time back. It's really about us. It's who we are, what we are, how we came to be, and where we might end up going sometime. I've always believed our destiny is in the stars. That's a hope that I have, that generations yet to come will travel out there and will become a part of that community. That's a dream that I won't live to see, but it's a dream I hold dear, that we'll make it, that we will survive as a species, because I think we've got some, as I jokingly say, we have some good friends in high places. Now I want to wrap up with one comment. I've shared this information about what we've learned and what the government knows. I say government, the black government. About, for example, the life of the young man from Galilee. We've been given some information, pretty reliable, about his life and about those who orchestrated it. From the birth, the whole years, he lived about 40 years, to the last series of tragic events where they hung him on a cross and all that. I've shared this with a lot of people who don't want to hear it. And they say, "Are you an atheist?" You know? And I say, no. To be honest with you, I think that I have become more spiritual from what I've learned. I'm not an atheist. I was born and raised a Christian. When I went through the university, I turned into a bit of an agnostic. But I am more spiritual today than I've ever been in my whole life. I believe, and I hold dear to my heart, that there is a singular conscious intelligence in the universe that is primarily spiritual, that is so vast, so loving and so powerful, that it is the source of all life, not only on this planet, but on all the others. And that there is a spark of that divinity burning in each and every one of us, and that's the little spark we call the human soul. But that singular conscious intelligence that I am aware of, that I respect and love, is what I call God. And people have said, "Do you believe in God?" And I say, no. I know.